We have the Gladiator up in the shop today for a pretty big job. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another video. We've owned the Gladiator for about 4 years now, and 3 years ago we decided to install a set of 513 gears, both front and rear. Paired with the 37s, the 8-speed transmission, and the 3.6 gas engine, it's a fantastic combo. We haven't had any issues out of the gears up until recently, when our pinion decided to go ahead and explode within itself. Now it's crazy because most of the times when you have a rear axle failure, you're off-roading, you're doing something crazy, you're spinning tires. In our case, none of that was true. We were simply driving down the highway at 75, 80 miles an hour. About 8 hours into the trip, the rear axle decided to disintegrate. So in this video, we're gonna open up the rear axle, make sure none of the damage spread, and of course, throw in a new ring and pinion. Hopefully find out what caused this issue. But let's go ahead and get the Jeep prepped so we can start pulling apart the rear axle and get these new gears installed. In order to make this job a little bit easier, we're gonna go ahead and lower and remove our spare tire. That's gonna give us some extra clearance and headroom down underneath the Jeep. Secondly, we're gonna go ahead and pull off the rear sway bar that blocks the diff cover. It's right in the middle, so we gotta get rid of that. And of course, remove the wheels and tires. We do need to keep in mind that re-gear jobs like this require quite a bit of special tools. We need a press, a bearing puller, and of course, general skills and knowledge of how to set up axles. Otherwise, this can end very bad. But with that being said, it's not necessarily a project that you can't tackle at home, but it is a job that I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying out your first time, not knowing what you're getting into. At this point, we are good to start draining the diff fluid, pop the diff cover, pull the shafts out, and get started with this re-gear process. But we didn't have the best luck with the Yukon gears, and I don't want to go into, blame on what actually happened. And I don't know, there's no telling. Once we pull it apart, we might be able to get a better look to see what happened, but who knows? It was driving on the highway, the pinion gear exploded. That's really all I know. Either way, moving forward, switching up to a Revolution gear and axle. I've heard great things about these gear sets. A lot of shops are switching over to using these just because the quality control is there, and setting up the axles seems to be a lot easier with these gear sets. So I am hoping we don't have any issues, but from what I've been hearing, Revolution is the way to go, and they're pumping out some really high quality products. So what we have here is the rear master overhaul kit. Doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're putting new gears in your Jeep, I would highly suggest going with a full master overhaul kit. What that's gonna get us is, of course, all of our shims for setting up our backlash, preload, everything we need here, all the boring stuff, and a full set of bearings, as well as new ring gear bolts. So we have Loctite ring gear bolts, our pinion bearing, looks like some carrier bearings, a seal, our crush sleeve, as well as a new pinion nut. So all of the bearings inside the diff are gonna need to be changed, since there's probably metal shavings all over. Regardless of whether your differential blew up or you're just doing a new gear install, always go for the full master install kit. Now the ring and pinion, we're gonna leave that in the box. We'll bust out later when it's time to take a look at it. But at this point, we are good to start pulling shafts, getting this rear axle completely empty and ready to set up with new gears. Before we can remove the carrier, we do have to pull both axle shafts. We have to think that the shaft rides inside the carrier into the splined portion, so we can't get this out until both shafts are out. So that side's out. All we have to do to pull these is remove our caliper, hang it up out of the way, and then there's 4 bolts, or actually nuts back here, that are for the axle shaft retainer plate. So we loosen and remove all 4 of those bolts, and then we can simply hit our shaft out of here. Now, if you have never changed your rear rotor or messed with it at all, there is a little Torx bolt right there that holds the shaft to the rotor. So you might have to pull that out. And like always, if your e-brakes are on, you are not getting this off. Before we go ahead and remove the carrier, since this is a Rubicon, we have to disconnect our locker actuator and the locker sensor. Now on the new JL and JTs, they run it single through here, and all we have to do is loosen up our stud, and there's an O-ring that holds this in place. We're gonna pull this out and remove this plug. And now we can get a nice clear view of that pinion. Man, It is crazy. The teeth just broke right off in there, and we really lucked out that nothing inside this housing just got trashed, because a lot of times those teeth will just get sent around into a bearing, and then boom, your carrier bearing, it just starts causing everything to be unusable. So we lucked out in this case, but that pinion is no good. In order to finish up pulling the old gears out, we need to get the pinion out of there. So we're gonna grab a 32mm socket, remove our pinion nut, grab a hammer and some brass punches, push the pinion out of there as well as the races. And just like that, our gears are removed. We can grab everything, bring it over to a workbench, and get started setting up our new gears. It's time to go ahead and start setting up our new carrier, or actually our existing carrier, with the new ring gear and fresh bearings. So when we pulled out our bearing caps, it's important to keep the shims. Now in our case, this is a re-gear job, so we might not be exactly like on spec with what the factory was, and we'll probably have to change a bunch. But typically, if you start out with whatever shims and settings that you started with, it's a good close starting point. On the Rubicon models, we are gonna have to remove our locker mechanism in order to remove the ring gear. It gets in the way. So we're gonna have to remove this bearing, being super careful. That's where this clamshell bearing kit puller comes into play. These are gonna go under the bearing, and then this is going to squeeze it up and out. What? This? Yeah. No, oh, the red ones? No, they're supposed to come apart like that, so you can put it on. Nope. So we're having a little bit of issues with the puller. It doesn't exactly want to get under this bearing. On the JLs and JTs, neither of the clamshells really fit this bearing right, so we'll try a few more times, but it's just kind of pulling up from the cage, and you actually see it. You know, it's
blowing the top of the bearing.
Yeah, it's messing it up. So eventually, if we can't get it off, we'll just have to cut it, grind it, and then get that, just kind of pry or hammer that bearing out of there. We were finally able to get the carrier bearing off. We had to score the bearing about halfway through and spent about 30 minutes with the chisel trying to get it off. Now on the Rubicons, I don't know the entire backstory behind that, but this locker plate right here consists of 3 parts. So it's this outer magnet, that little locker shell, and then on the carrier, there's 4 tabs. So what we're gonna do, and I don't really know why, but you wanna mark the orientation of the carrier, the locker assembly, and this little, we need to mark this guy too, because that plate spins independently. Yeah. So pretty much we want to make sure those tabs go back in the same spot. And I could be completely wrong, but I've heard a lot of stories about these locker plates going back in a different way and the locker just not working at all. So to play it safe, mark all 3, and then we're free to go ahead, remove the ring gear off this guy, and start pulling this other bearing as well. At this point, the carrier is ready to have the new Revolution ring gear installed. So, you know, looking at the gear sets, there's really nothing you can look at. I mean, it looks like a nice pinion and a nice ring gear, but honestly, as long as it lasts a lot longer than the Yukon set, then I'll be happy with it. So setting up gears and everything can, if you set it up incorrectly, that can lead to a ring and pinion failure. But in this case, like looking at the ring gear, like it looks really good. Me and Mike were talking about that earlier. You know, there's no visible damage to the ring gear. It's isolated the pinion. So I think the setup was spot on last time. There was just an issue with either the teeth being too small or an actual like manufacturing defect. But at this point, we are good to go ahead, and really what we're gonna do is just line up the bolts, put it on the carrier, press it down as good as we can. But you wanna throw that on there, show them? So this set actually slides on pretty dang good. So it goes all the way, almost all the way down. We'll line up the holes, tap it with the hammer, and then the Revolution Master Install Kit comes with new hardware. You always want to reuse, or not reuse, you want to grab new ring gear bolts. We do have Loctite in here, but these look like they have yellow Loctite, which is an oil resistant Loctite. So maybe one tiny dab of red Loctite, but getting those old ones off, we had the impact and the MAP gas heating them up, and it was still like they didn't want to break free. Torque spec's 130 to 150 foot-pounds on this. So this is our little contraption in order to torque the ring gear bolts down. So you have to have a locker of some sort, otherwise the spider gears, it's gonna act as an open diff. But we put the tire down, threw the shaft in, and we're manually pushing on the locker pins up here so the locker stays engaged, and we should be able to torque these down without using a big...
massive vise.
I don't have a massive vise
for the diff.
Yeah.
And we don't want to screw the diff up, so.
Yeah. And then you gotta have wood plates or the plastic plates. Ready? One. Let's
get a marker.
Yeah. The JLs and JTs, the carrier shims are external of the bearing, so we don't have to worry about making setup bearings or putting shims underneath. We just we're going. Now that we have the carrier and ring gear all set up, good to go, we can go ahead and start thinking about the pinion. Now there's a few different ways to do it. We can just install the new bearings, or we can use our old bearings and make setup bearings. The benefit to making a setup bearing set is, you know, if we're gonna have to continually change out shims a few times to get our gear pattern right, we're gonna have to hit our old pinion bearings out of the housing just like we did removing them. With the brass punch, hit one out the back, one out the front. Or we can make setup bearings with our old bearings. So what we do is just grind or shave down the outside diameter of this bearing so we can put it in and out of the housing without having to press it in, or hit it out. So what we're gonna do is take this one, I already turned this one into a setup bearing. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, just enough so you can slide it in and out of the housing. We're gonna do the same thing on this one with our, why am I drawing a blank on that guy?
Belt sander.
Belt sander, there we go. A little bit more. Close, but no cigar. This is what a setup bearing should do. You should be able to push it in. If we need to change out the shims, pull the bearing out, change the shims, and then once we go towards our final assembly, when we're done and happy with the gear pattern, we throw the new bearings back in. It's not even the bearing, just the race. Yep. In cat litter. Wonderful. Now that we have the setup bearings made, it's time to go ahead and press our new bearing onto the pinion. Once again, there are no shims underneath the pinion bearing, which is good. During disassembly, these were the two shims that we pulled out from underneath the bearing race. Now with the setup bearing, we're simply gonna reinstall those inside of our pinion as a starting point. Now there is another way to do this. If you're coming from factory gears, on the top head of the pinion, there's some numbers there. You can actually compare those to your factory gears. Most of the factory gears have those markings, and you can do some calculations to find out what shims you're going with. But the Yukon didn't use that numerical system, so we're kind of shooting in the blank since we're going from Yukon to these. But I'll put a link in the video description if you want to find out what these numbers mean and how to set up your gears according to these. So we're gonna throw the setup bearings in with these two shims and see where it gets us. So I'm gonna back up a little bit and explain what we did. You know, with the setup bearings, we put the pinion in, got the yoke and old pinion nut started. So pretty much we assembled the pinion without the crush sleeve or without the seal, just enough to tighten up the yoke and pinion so it was nice and turned. You could still turn it, but it was nice and firm. Put in our carrier with the original shims, tighten down our bearing carrier caps to, I think it was what, 70 foot-pounds. And then now we're gonna check our backlash just for our initial setup. So Mike and I just checked it and it was right around 9, and the spec, what was the spec? 5 thousandths to 8 thousand, or 3 to 3 to 5 thousandths according to Spicer. This is something I want to talk on real quick. I was going through editing the video and I realized I didn't bring it up, and not too many people talk about this. If you are installing a Dana Spicer gear set, that is their ADVANTEK gear technology found in the JLs and JTs. That's a 2-cut gear, which means your backlash is gonna be a lot tighter, that 3 to 6 thou range. Now, if you're installing an aftermarket set of gears, whether it's Yukon, Motive, Revolution, all of those are usually a 5-cut gear, which is gonna be a 6 to 10 backlash spec. All of the other things, your pinion preload, all of that's gonna go to according to Spicer, but your actual backlash is going to vary depending on your gears that you're setting up. If we set up our dial indicator here, set it at 0 with the gear, I guess we can really do whatever, but we set our dial indicator at 0 and then rotate the ring gear back and forward, and we can see that that's 10 thousandths right there, going from 0 to 90. So we are going to have to add shims on this side. These are the steps right here where having the general knowledge of how to set up gears and what all affects one another when you start changing shims. That's where all of this comes into play, because, you know, I just mentioned we might add a little bit over on the driver's side to increase the preload, but if we don't take some away from the passenger side, the ring gear isn't gonna scoot over, it's just gonna get tighter. So, you know, if we're gonna add 3 thousandths on this side, we might take 1 thousandths on this side and add the other 2 over on that side. So we have some playing around to do. I'm gonna set the camera up, but for the most part, you know, the first thing we're gonna do is set our backlash while maintaining a good preload on the carrier. And that's how tight you put it in there. Some people will use a case spreader to actually spread the case apart, put the gears and all your shims in there, and then undo the case spreader, and then boom, your pinion preload set. But sometimes you don't have all those fancy tools. With 3 thousandths of a shim over, we actually went all the way down to about 2 thousandths of backlash, which is way too tight. So what we're gonna do is go ahead and run a gear pattern check, because we have to think, if the pinion is too close, then we're gonna have to move the pinion away, and we're not gonna know that until we do a gear pattern check. If we have to move the pinion away, that also opens up a little bit of the backlash. So I'm hoping we run a gear pattern check, the pinion's too close and we have to push it away anyways, which means our backlash is gonna open up a little bit. So if you guys are looking for a video that goes much more in depth than currently, go back to my JK 1-ton swap video series, the 14 bolt or the Dana 60 video. I go through and explain exactly what you need to move, what each shim does and all that, and how to get an accurate and correctly set up rear end. Yep. Unfortunately, we're not gonna be lucky. I was hoping the pinion would need to be moved away like I just said, but as you can tell, this is our drive side right here. The pinion is a little bit shallow, so the pinion is gonna have to come in more, which means it is gonna tighten up the backlash a lot. So we did some calculations on the board over here. I'm gonna show you what I like to do. Starting off, you know, driver and passenger side, individual shim thicknesses. We had a 47, 47, and a 25, which came out to 120 total shim pack on the driver. Passenger was a 30 and 30, which came out to 60. Total was 180. And that was a little bit loose going in the carrier, so we tried bumping up the total shim stack to 183, give us 3 thousandths more carrier preload. So what we have in there now is a 47, 47, a 30, and a 5 to bump us up to 130. So what we're gonna do is take this 5 out of there, leave the 30, which is additional 5 over our initial setup, and then on the passenger side, we're gonna run, we're gonna have to figure that out because we gotta match this. We're going up on 5 there, so we might bring that We might put a 5. Actually, we might leave a 3 in there. I don't know. So we just readjusted the shims and it looks like we're at 7 thousandths backlash now. Time to add a little bit of shim thickness. So the original ones, or the ones we had in there last, were a 30 thousandths and a 5 thousandths. Pulled out that 5 and threw a 10 in there. So we're running 40 thousandths. And this is the reason we run setup bearings, just so we can slide those new shims in and pop our bearing back in. And if we need to change them, we just pull them back out and throw new shims in. So we're gonna go ahead and reinstall everything once again, check our backlash, see if that made a change, and then check the gear pattern to see if it brought it any closer. Third setup time, we have accomplished a good backlash. We're at 6 thousandths, so bringing the pinion in a little bit deeper helped. What we need to do now is fine tune this pattern. So we're gonna bring the pinion a little bit deeper just to bring it down, and over here on the coast side, let's see, it's still favoring the heel side. So the heel is closer to the carrier, toe is out here, then you have the face of the gears up here. So we're wanting to bring it down in closer to the bottom of the gear as well as in towards the toe. And this is so the coast side on these is the sloped, and the drive side is the more straight face. So this is the coast side, this is the drive side. So the drive side is nice and centered, but we need to go a little deeper into the teeth. So we're gonna add a 3 thousandths to the pinion. I think we finally have some success. So we've done this is what, the 4th or 5th time, Mike? And maybe more than that, who's counting? This is our final gear pattern. So on the drive side, nice and centered in the tooth. And then over on the coast side, that's not too shabby as well. Hopefully the camera picks it up. There's a lot of glare going on. All we have left to do is tear it all out once again. And then that's where we install our new pinion bearings into the axle. We have to put our crush sleeve in there, the pinion seal, and then start crushing our crush sleeve to get our correct pinion preload. So we're gonna rip all this out, put those new races in. And that's what I love about doing axle jobs is like in the end, it's either in spec or it's not. So most of the times, if you have a bad install, it's due to somebody just not really caring. And we were talking about this earlier, like getting the pinion or the carrier preload. You know, if I owned a shop, or not me personally, but shop owners, they're super quick to just be like, you know what, that's good enough, get it out the door. Whereas if you do it at home, I'm not saying all shops are like that, but if you do it at home, as long as you know what you're doing and you know what the specs are, it's almost impossible to mess this up. I say that, but there's always a way to mess it up. But I'm rambling. As long as it's within spec, your gear job's gonna be good to go. Now that we have the races driven into the pinion, this is our crush sleeve right here. So what this does is actually crush down under torque, allowing our pinion preload to get tighter. So the further this goes down, the tighter the pinion, both of the bearings are gonna squeeze against each other, making it harder or looser to turn. Now the crush sleeve, once it goes past a certain point, it stays there. You'd have to replace it with a new one. So we'll go through this in a little bit, but we're gonna set on the JL and JTs with this flat little knurl on the bottom. That side goes down. All right, before we get our pinion back in, we're gonna install the pinion seal. So there's a little bit of orange RTV kind of substance on there, and they do make seal drivers. Mike was asking if I had one. I normally just tap it in. So there's a little bit of up and down play in the yoke still, and in and out means the crush sleeve isn't even started to crush yet. But we do have to be careful on over tightening this crush sleeve. So I'm just gonna watch, it's gonna be like a quarter turn. we're gonna take it off and check by hand. Okay, so we might have started crushing it. Once we think that we're possibly starting to crush the crush sleeve, we're gonna grab our little beam indicator. You want it in inch pounds because we're measuring, at least on the JL and JT axles, the Rubicon was 13.5 inch pounds up to 21 inch pounds. So we're probably gonna be in the middle, any around 17, 16. But what we're gonna do is get a bunch of adapters to go up to the pinion nut size. These are usually 1/4 inch. And we're gonna see how many inch pounds it takes to rotate it. In our case, right now we're at 3 inch pounds, and it's not the inch pounds that it takes to start the turn, it's what you're doing while you're turning it. So those numbers will be different. It's harder to start it than it is to continue. So we're still way too low, which means we're gonna switch back to the impact and get about a 1/4 turn on it and see what happens. It's looking around 15 now. Yeah, now we're at 20. We are calling this good. It's time to put the carrier back in there and then do one final backlash and gear pattern check. So we finished up this gear job yesterday and I am super happy with how it turned out. So as you can tell, I've went ahead and put torque seal on all the bolts inside here. That way, whenever we pop the diff cover, we can visually see and make sure that none of the bolts loosened up. So for the final setup, our gear pattern is, I'm happy with it. It's nice and centered on both the coast and drive side. So coast side's up here, drive side's down there. Our backlash, once all said and done, was right around 5 or 6 thousandths, which is perfectly in spec. Our pinion preload was right at 20. We have a good gear pattern. I am super happy with it. I've already put on the axle shafts and the rotors. All we have left to do is hook up the rear drive shaft, fill this thing with oil, throw the diff cover back on. Diff cover first probably would make it easiest. And then hit the road and start working on the break-in period. So the break-in period's 500 miles. Drive it easy, let the diff cool, go through a few different heat cycles, and then pop the diff cover 500 miles later and make sure everything is still good to go. So let's wrap all of this up and go hit the road. So far, everything feels good, it sounds good, the Jeep is driving nice and smooth, no weird noises. I think it's safe to say that our re-gear job is complete. So I'm gonna drive about 10 more minutes down this back road, hit up a gas station, let the gears cool off for 20 or 30 minutes, and then drive on home, and then finish up the 500-mile break-in. Then we're gonna change the fluid and inspect the gears one more time. But I think, typically if there's an issue, you'll know right off the bat. And so far, this thing is driving extremely nice. But we still have a long way to go. I never had any previous issues with my Yukons until about 40,000 miles in, and we weren't rock crawling, we weren't doing anything crazy, just decided to blow up on the highway. So hopefully this time around with the Revolution gears, we'll have a little better luck, but we will see. That's gonna pretty much sum up this video, guys. I know it wasn't exactly a step-by-step on how to install gears, but between this video and all the other wealth of knowledge on the internet, hopefully you can find out that it's not an overly complex task. It is fairly meticulous and you need to know what you're doing, otherwise you can end up with a really bad result. But it's one of those jobs where at the end of the day, it's either in spec or it's not. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.